Hi, everyone. I'm Rena Ninen. Thank you for joining us. The impeachment of President Trump will likely soon move from the Democratic-controlled House to the Republican-controlled Senate. On Friday, the House Judiciary Committee voted along party lines to advance 2 articles of impeachment to the full House floor. Democrats are charging the president with abuse of power in his administration's dealings with Ukraine and obstruction of Congress in the House's subsequent investigation. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler spoke briefly following the vote.
Today is a solemn and sad day. For the third time in a little over a century and a half, the House Judiciary Committee has voted articles of impeachment against the president for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The House will act expeditiously. Thank you.
A Democratic aide told CBS News that the House is likely to vote on impeachment Wednesday, and if approved, the Senate will hold a trial in January. Both the White House and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell have already begun planning for the next steps. The two sides have been in close contact on their strategy. Here's what President Trump said on Friday about the trial.
I'll do whatever I want. Look, we did nothing wrong. So I'll do long or short. I've heard Mitch, I've heard Lindsey. I think they are very much on agreement on some concept. I'll do whatever they want to do. It doesn't matter. I wouldn't mind a long process.
Joining me now, CBS News White House correspondent Paula Reid. So Paula, are the White House and the Senate coordinated on this?
They are. They're working to unify these two competing visions. The president has said that for a Senate trial, he wants a show. He wants to call witnesses. He wants his day in court. But GOP leaders, Rena, have sent him some not so subtle hints that they believe when it comes to his defense, less is more. They want to get this over with quickly. Now, I know that the president's top lawyer, White House counsel Pat Cipollone, and his top legislative affairs aide, Eric Gouland, they have been meeting with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to strategize on the best way to approach this trial. And we've learned that they will continue to meet throughout the next week.
Do we have a sense of who might be representing the president in the Senate trial?
So we know that the president's defense in impeachment has been led by White House counsel Pat Cipollone. The president has many attorneys. He has a team of private lawyers. But because the impeachment inquiry focuses on conduct in office, they had the White House counsel take the lead. Now, it's unclear. There have been some reports that Pat is going to argue on behalf of the president at the Senate trial. Rena, I've spoken to multiple sources here at the White House who say they haven't made any decision about who will argue or present on behalf of the president. Pat Cipollone is expected to be the architect of the president's defense, but he could actually have several people who present on his behalf in a Senate trial. But the president has also floated the idea of adding a constitutional scholar, Alan Dershowitz, to his defense team to advise on constitutional issues. But Dershowitz, while he has been a stalwart advocate of the president, defending him on television, he comes with some baggage. He, of course, represented convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein back in 2006, and some of Epstein's victims, at least one of them, has accused Dershowitz of being one of the people to whom she was made available for sex. So some folks argue that they really just don't need to bring another heated controversy into this already very contentious process.
And Paul, you spoke to the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. He was actually at the White House on Friday. He's at the center of the Ukraine investigation. What did he tell you?
He is, Rena. We saw him coming here to the White House where he stayed for 2 hours. And I spoke with him after he left his meeting with the president. He told me that he recently returned from Ukraine where he needed to purchase an extra suitcase to hold all of the documents that he collected as he was there investigating the Bidens and these unsubstantiated claims that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election. Now, Rena, I was a little skeptical. I thought maybe that was some hyperbole, that he needed an extra roller bag, but I pressed him on it, and he actually gave me the name of the store in Vienna where he purchased this suitcase. So it does appear that he brought a lot back. When we saw him here at the White House yesterday, he arrived with a stack of documents. And I asked him, is that information from your trip to Ukraine that you gathered? Did you present this to the president? Citing attorney-client privilege, he would not reveal that. But he did tell me, Rita, he is in constant communication with his client, the president, even though Giuliani is at the center of these events that led to impeachment, and he's currently under investigation by the Trump Justice Department.
So do you have a sense, Paula, is the president just doubling down on Rudy Giuliani at this point?
Yeah, he's been fully committed to his personal attorney. We've asked the president about this. We've asked people around him. Why would you continue to keep Giuliani on your team? Is he really serving your best interests? But the president believes that he is. He believes, he still sees Rudy Giuliani as he was in 9/11. He believes that the former mayor of New York brings gravitas to his defense, despite all of his legal troubles that I just detailed. Not everyone on the president's legal team shares this impression. Anytime Giuliani has weighed in, he did an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago defending the president. We asked the White House about that. Rena, they were very quick to distance themselves from Mr. Giuliani. They noted that he's a private citizen and they're not coordinating with him in any way. But it really doesn't matter what the staffers here at the White House think. If ultimately his client, the president of the United States, wants him on the team, he's here to stay. Yesterday he was here for 2 hours.
What a good point, Paula. And, despite this impeachment hearing moving forward and sucking up so much oxygen every day, we know that the White House did get some positive developments. They were able to strike a deal with Democrats on the president's replacement for the North American Free Trade Agreement. We know that President Trump has inked a phase 1 agreement with China on trade. We still don't know the details, but the White House is saying this is a win. And he could even get his Space Force if he approves the defense spending bill. So what's the White House? What are they saying about this past week?
It's such a great point, Rena, because repeatedly the president has said, look, you're so focused on impeachment on the Hill, you're not getting anything done. But I've spoken with multiple sources here in the White House who for the past several months, they have continued to work on this legislation, specifically the president's signature trade deal, the USMCA, that new North American trade deal. They were confident that even despite the impeachment proceedings, that there wasn't a bipartisan support that they would be able to push this across the line. And they were able to come to an agreement with Democrats. They have been able to make some progress on other legislative accomplishments. So that really undercuts the president's argument that the Hill can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Remember, there's a lot of people who work at this White House, too, whose job has nothing to do with impeachment. But it's important to note that the USMCA doesn't look like it did when the president first negotiated it. In order to get approval from Democrats, they needed to make some compromises, specifically on issues related to labor and the environment. And now that this bill will go to the Senate, that's why you see the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He's sort of lukewarm on the USMCA now. He said he'll take a vote on that after the impeachment trial. There are some Republicans who are frustrated by the compromises that were needed to get this legislative accomplishment. But Marina, Democrats, the White House, they all needed to show voters they are at least doing something, even if neither side is fully satisfied with this deal.
Yep, that holiday recess is almost upon us here. Paula, I want to ask you before you go, it's really interesting. The Supreme Court says that it will rule on the release of the president's financial records. What are Democrats have been trying to chase this down for a while. How's the White House legal team responding? And the fact that the president's been able to put some conservatives there on the White House, the Supreme Court bench. Do we have a sense of how this might go down?
Well, so far, the president has not been successful with his arguments to keep his tax returns private in the lower courts. It will be interesting to see. This is arguably an issue of first impression, which is why the Supreme Court is taking this up. A president who does not want to reveal his tax returns. There have been multiple efforts to try to obtain them. And what's so interesting, Rena, is if the Supreme Court decides the president does have to share these, he's not the one who hands them over. It's the small accounting firm that he uses, and that accounting firm has been clear. Whatever the final ruling is, they will comply. So it's not like if the president doesn't like how this ends at the Supreme Court, he can just continue to fight. But it will be very interesting to see. Right now, the president's attorneys, they welcome the fact. The president's personal attorney, Jay Sekulow, he released a statement saying that he was pleased that the Supreme Court will review these cases. They raise, quote, significant constitutional issues. But it's unclear if the president will ultimately prevail at the Supreme Court. For the most part, Rena, while the administration's policies have not always fared well in the courts, personally, the president really has been pretty successful in dodging consequences. He will likely not be removed from office in impeachment. He was obviously mostly cleared in the Mueller investigation, and Congress chose not to take up some of those additional questions Mueller left on the table. So this is potentially the first time the president could see a big loss, or he could be completely vindicated, as you said, perhaps in part to some of the justices that he has appointed. One thing you just cannot deny President Trump is he has had enormous success stacking the federal judiciary with conservative judges.
He certainly has, and something that we will certainly hear in his re-election campaign. I'm sure great success with that. Paula, Reid, I want to thank you very much for joining us. Well, for more, I want to bring in Zach Cohen. He covers the Senate for National Journal, and he joins us now. So, Zach, from the Senate's perspective, why does Mitch McConnell want to coordinate with the White House on the impeachment trial? What does he have to gain?
So one of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's biggest priorities is trying to keep his conference together, and that includes being in concert with the White House. We have to remember that the president and a third of the Senate is going to be up for re-election in less than a year in November 2020, including Senate Majority Leader McConnell. And they'll be interested in trying to keep this process very contained, very controlled. We've heard as little as a 2-week trial, which is much shorter than the Clinton impeachment trial of 1999. And the Majority Leader will be interested in keeping his conference together and doesn't want to see any of his incumbents annoy or confuse the president's base as they're all up for re-election.
So Senate Republicans, do you get the sense they are really confident that the whole conference will stick together against removal in the Senate?
I think I've heard that most people think that it's more likely that Democrats would vote to acquit rather than Republicans would vote to acquit. I think what we're seeing is that most of the Republicans are very uncomfortable with what they've seen in the House in that process. Most of them signed on to a resolution a few weeks ago condemning the House process and saying that the president and his team didn't have, or Republicans in general, didn't have the sort of input into the House's impeachment that they would have liked. We could see some defections, people like Mitt Romney, maybe Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, some Republican moderates that in the past have broken with the president or with the Senate Republican majority. But for the most part, it's more likely than not that every Republican in the Senate does vote to acquit Trump of both articles of impeachment come next month.
So as impeachment went on this week, House Democrats and the White House came to an agreement on the USMCA, the trade deal with Canada and Mexico. So as our Paula Reid mentioned, Mitch McConnell says he's not going to actually bring this deal to the Senate floor to get voted on. Why is he holding it up?
So the House is set to approve the implementing legislation sometime next week. And after that, that gives the Senate precious few days before they're scheduled to leave for the Christmas, New Year's Eve recess. And under Trade Promotion Authority, the fast-track legislative procedure that's used to approve these trade deals, the Senate gets 30 days to look at the deal both in the Finance Committee, run by Chuck Grassley, and on the full floor. And some Senate Republicans are not very pleased with some of the concessions that Speaker Pelosi has managed to get out of the White House and out of U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. So they're going to want time to look at this. They're going to want time to look at the implementing legislation, especially any changes that have happened since the final agreement was worked out between the United States, Mexico, and Canada.
You know, you've got these Democratic senators, Ron Wyden and Sherrod Brown, who both came out in favor of this deal. Is that significant in gaining momentum in the Senate?
Certainly. Sherrod Brown, he's a Democrat from Ohio, just won re-election there. He's never voted for a trade deal in his life, mostly because free trade can have negative impacts on manufacturing in the United States, as we've seen after the NAFTA agreement that the USMCA is meant to replace. This is a pretty clear sign that Democrats got what they wanted when it comes to labor protection enforcement. This is something that Senator Brown and Senator Wyden have been pushing for in negotiations, and something House Democrats have been pushing for, and indicates that there could be and likely will be bipartisan support for this deal when it does come to the Senate floor. This is particularly important because on the left, from environmental groups, there's been a push to get Democrats to oppose the deal because it doesn't have sufficient environmental protections. And so if the labor protections sort of outweigh the environmental ones, you could see a lot of support for it in the Senate from both parties.
Speaking of needing bipartisan support, before we go, I've got to ask you about Congress needing to avert yet another shutdown by the end of next week. It feels like these come up every couple weeks. You know, folks always wonder why this can't take longer, right? I know this is complicated, but House Appropriations Committee Chairman Nita Lowey said there's a tentative agreement in place to fund the government through the end of September 2020. How do those negotiations look like on the Senate side?
Right. So Chairwoman Lowey did tell me and a couple of other reporters last week they do have an agreement in principle on all of the funding bills that would need to pass Congress by this coming Friday, December 20th, before the current stopgap continuing resolution expires. This current one lasted about a month. They passed it last month to sort of give negotiations more time to figure out things like border security funding, backfilling on projects that were delayed by the president's emergency declaration to build physical barriers on the southern border. So they now officially have this agreement. We should see text sometime early next week, Sunday or Monday, is what I've heard. And the House will vote on it Tuesday, send it over to the Senate, and that'll give Congress just enough time to pass all these bills in time to avert another shutdown less than a year after the last one.
So it's likely Congress will reach a deal with the White House.
That's the understanding, right? Anything can change. Lots of things can happen the last week before Christmas, but everybody I've talked to seems to think that a shutdown is likely, if not an impossibility at this point.
Zach Cohen, thank you very much, Zach.
Anytime.